Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to show you 5 most beautiful, in my opinion, checkmate patterns. Chess is all about patterns, and learning them and transforming the theoretical knowledge into a skill is crucial. So we're going to have a look at 5 very nice checkmating patterns, starting with the Anastasia mate and ending with the most famous of all, probably Smothered Mate, and we're going to learn how to recognize when they are possible. So starting with the Anastasia mate, it's a checkmating pattern where the knight controls 2 squares, cutting the king off from the knight file. So in this case, the knight would be on e7, and then a rook or a queen, a piece that can attack vertically, delivers mate down the h file. It's a very famous pattern, and it's named after a pattern that first appeared in the 19th century novel called Anastasia und das Schachspiel, so the game of chess, by the German author Johann Wilhelm Heinse. So in this case, and I think this example is pretty simple, this is Peter Roth versus George Reina, played in 1975. White played knight e7 check. The king has only one move, king h8, and then rook h7, a rook sacrifice. You can see that the knight is cutting the king off from g6 and g8, and after king h7, rook h1, checkmate. Okay, so this is the simplest example. Now the second example happened in a game which Sergei Karyakin played, and he played against Tauno Metsalu in the Keres Memorial 2001. In this case, what do? How do you deliver Anastasia's mate? It's the same principle. The knight is on e7, it's cutting the king off from g6 and g8. You play queen h7 check. Black in this case resigned. If he hadn't resigned, the game would have continued. King takes queen and rook h3, checkmate. Now on to something a bit harder. So this is the game which was played in the World Youth Under 14 in 2003 between 2 famous Norwegians, Jon Ludvig Hammer and Magnus Carlsen. In this case, Hammer blundered. So you know the pattern. You're going to see how Magnus Carlsen checkmated Hammer, but Hammer had a way to avoid checkmate. So you can pause the video here and try to avoid Anastasia's mate as white. So the only move to avoid mate was to dislodge the queen, because what happened in the game, Hammer played a random move, bishop e3, and the checkmate is very simple. Rook takes e4. And now, whatever you do, well, you have to sort of give up your pieces. You have to play g3 or f4. After f4, the bishop's just hanging. On g3, knight g3, fg3, rook e3, and you're losing a bunch of material. It's not that mate is unavoidable, but you have to play g3 or f4, or I don't know, maybe bishop c5, and then you lose the g4 pawn. In any case, he played rook e1, and now a very nice mate. Once again, g3 and g1 are covered, so queen h5 check. The only way to avoid mate is, of course, to take, and now rook h4 would have been played. Hammer resigned on queen h5, but rook h4 would have been checkmate. Now coming back to the original position, how do you avoid mate? Well, the threat, as we can see, is queen h5 after rook e4. So the only way to avoid it, and to avoid losing a bunch of material, is a4. And after a4, Black's queen has to move. It has to move to c4 to defend the knight, or to a6 to defend the knight. And after queen c4, let's say, now bishop e3, rook e4, and it's not the same thing. You can actually play rook e1, because if, I don't know, rook takes g4, then you just take on e2, and there's no more checkmate. The final example was played between Richard Lemon and Mark Plum. I don't know if that's a joke, but it sounds like a joke. 2 guys named after fruit, and the guy who lost embarrassingly was named Lemon. I don't know. In any case, Lemon took the knight on c4, and once again, very simple checkmate. You know it by now. Knight e2 followed by rook h2. White resigned here. If king h1, then takes, king takes, and of course rook h8. So now we're going to move on to Nocti, and I'm going to show you an easy way to get more examples and to practice Anastasia's mate on your own. If you follow the links in the description and in the comments below, you will have access to detailed themes on Nocti covering each of the checkmates we're going to be looking at in the video. And you're also going to have access to a completely free theme covering the basis of each mating pattern. Samuel from Nocti has prepared this for this video. And if you follow the link to the grouped study, you will be able to learn the basics of each checkmate. So now let's have a look at Anastasia's mate. I'm going to use the detailed studies. Now these detailed themes, these are available to premium members only. If you want to visit them and use them, use the code Hanging Pawns to unlock all of Nocti's premium features and get a massive 64% discount. Now, there are many, many more themes you can be covering. As you can see here, I create my own themes for every game I play almost, and for every critical position I didn't understand, and I have a bunch of them. So let's start with Anastasia's mate. So, learn. Okay. To execute Anastasia's mate, it's a classic idea to precede the checkmate with a queen sacrifice. Now, this is the game we have seen, the Magnus Carlsen game. So we play, we would play queen h5 check. And after takes, rook h4. Okay. And, okay. Now, let's do something on our own. In this case, I think rook h2, king h2, queen h4 check is winning. Okay. Okay, good, complete. Let's do another one. Can you find the mate in 5? Now, I haven't done these on my own, as you could have seen. I haven't completed this, so I'm gonna... Okay, so this is knight e7, king h8, queen h7, king h7, rook h1. Okay, black has to keep giving away pieces. Good. White to move and mate in 2. Oh, it's nice. It's one rank up. So we go queen h6 check, king h6, rook h3. Nice. The second pattern is Vukovic's Mate, which is, for me personally, the most important one because it was named after a Croatian guy. So in his book, The Art of Attacking Chess, Vladimir Vukovic introduced this famous pattern which involves mating with knight and rook, but the king has to support the two pieces. The first game we are going to see was played between Howard Staunton and Elijah Williams, and they played a couple of matches, but this was a match played in London in 1851. So in this position, how do you play mate in 3? There is only one way. And this famous combination of pieces is able to deliver a mate with knight h2. The king only has, the king has 2 moves, but on king g1 there is simply rook d1. So after king e1, knight f3 check, the king only has 1 move, king f1, and now rook f2 check. So Vukovic's mate is a checkmate where the king or another piece needs to defend the rook, therefore preventing king f2 in this case. The king is, of course, by the rook cut off from g2 and e2, and the knight controls g1 and e1. So that's Vukovic's mate. Now let's have a look at an example from actual tournament play in recent times. So this game was played in Gibraltar 2020 between Mustafa Yilmaz and I don't know who Luyan is, but I think it's a female player, probably relatively high rated. And in this position, of course, black's completely busted, but you want to support the f7 square somehow in order to play rook f7 mate. So what Yilmaz played was, of course, bishop g6. And now if you move your bishop away, I'm going to take it. There's nowhere to move it to. So, for example, bishop d7, I just take, bishop f7 is mate. So the best move probably is to take the bishop. You're getting mated either way. So he took. But notice how the pawn now defends the f7 square. So white's actually threatening rook f7 checkmate. It's the same idea. It's just that the king isn't on g6 defending f7. And white doesn't have forced mate. Black could have postponed things with knight e7. Not that it works, because when black plays knight e7, white goes g7, and black is losing the knight because white's gonna queen. But black played rook g3, which is just mate in 1. Rook f7 check. And it's the same checkmate. Once again, the rook is cutting the king off from g7, f7, the knight's defending g8 and e8. Sorry, the rook is cutting away from e7. So it's the same type of mating pattern. Okay, let's learn Vukovic's mate on Nocti. Okay, let's continue with the Vukovic mate. Let's learn. Named after IM Vladimir Vukovic, coordination between rook and a knight. Okay, we know that. So rook f7. It may seem like white's in serious trouble, but Vukovic mate saves the day. Okay, knight check, king and rook d7. Okay. Okay, time for some puzzles. White to move and mate in 2. The way I see it, it's knight g6, rook g8, and king g8 and rook g7. Okay, let's do one more. Black to move and mate in 2. Knight g3, king g1, rook g2 mate. Okay, good. So that's the Vukovic mate. You can follow the link to the separate theme on the Vukovic mate to complete more on your own. The third mating pattern we're going to have a look at is Arabian Mate, and this is probably the most aesthetically pleasing if you ask me. It involves usually just the rook and the knight, and is delivered on h2 or on g1, depending on where the white king is. And in this particular case, this is a game between Reiner and Steinitz, played in 1860. If black could magically play rook g1, that would be mate, because Arabian Mate involves a knight defending these two squares and cutting the king off. So if the rook comes to g1, the king cannot move. So all black has to do is somehow dislodge this rook from g4. So Steinitz played the brilliant queen h4. And of course, if you take the queen, then rook g1 checkmate. If you don't take the queen, then queen h2 checkmate. So Reiner played the only move that delays mate for a bit, rook g2, defending against rook g1 and defending against queen h2. But now there is a beautiful finish. Once again, remember, all you have to do is rook g1 checkmate. So Steinitz played queen takes h2 check. You have to take with the rook because the knight defends, and now simply rook g1 mate, and the game is over. Now we're going to have a look at another example, which is similar. It, of course, is the same pattern, but it's slightly more complicated. In this position, white just took on f6. And you can notice that black has rook g2 as a resource. It's a check. So black did play rook g2 check, and Koltanovsky played king h1. Now, Koltanovsky was a very strong player, and he played simuls and blindfold simuls all the time. So in this position, how does black avoid mate? Of course, queen h7 is threatened, and what can you do? So he just played rook to g7, defending. And of course, we win the same way, the same brilliant way. It's just not mate on g8, it's going to be mate on h7. Queen takes h7, rook h7 check. So it's the same pattern. It could be on any of these two squares. Let's learn it on Nocti. Okay, let's have a look at the Arabian Mate on Nocti. As you can see, I haven't even started this, so let's learn. Elegant checkmate pattern involving just rook and a knight. Okay, we know that. So in this case, rook a2. Often the Arabian Mate is preceded by a sacrifice, as demonstrated in this example. So queen h6, gh, and rook g8 is going to be the answer. Yep. Okay. White to move and mate in 2. Queen h6, gh6, rook g8 has to be the answer. Good. Can you find the mate in 2? Yes, I can. Okay. White to move and win. Knight f6, king g8, rook h8, rook h3. Okay. Good. Okay. So the Arabian Mate, I think we took care of that. You can solve the rest on your own by following the link below. Next up we have Greco's Mate, probably the second most famous. So Greco's Mate is a mate delivered by a major piece and either a bishop or a queen covering this diagonal. So in this case a2 g8, forcing the king into the corner, and then a major piece delivers mate down the h-file. So in this case, this game was played between Sidney Johnson and Frank Marshall in 1899. All white has to do is make sure that the king stays in the corner. So he played knight e7 check. It's a double check, so you cannot play rook f7 or bishop c4 or whatever else. The king must go to h8. And now, how do we deliver mate? Well, in this case, knight g6 opens up the h-file, and it has to be taken. The knight has to be taken by the h-pawn. And once knight g6 is played, you only have one move, takes. Now you can see that the bishop is covering g8 and hg3 is unavoidable mate. The only move you have is queen h4. And I had something very similar in a game of mine played in my last tournament. Unfortunately, I had a bishop on g3 and the rook on e3, so I couldn't play rook h3 mate, but I had a knight on e5, I had a bishop on b3, and I could have played knight g6 check, hg6, but unfortunately my bishop on g3 after hg6 was preventing rook h3 mate, and that was a very interesting position. You can have a look at that game. I'm actually gonna record it in a couple of days, haven't recorded it yet, and I don't want to ruin it by showing the position here, but you're gonna see it in a couple of days. So the second example of Greco's Mate is fairly similar. In this position, black played bishop e6, trying to, dislodge the bishop, but we know that the same pattern works. So how do we open up the h-file? Knight g6, of course, h6, only move, rook h4. This is from the game in which Max Ewe beat Wiersma. I don't know who that is, but it was played in 1920 when Ewe was relatively strong, although probably not at his peak yet. The final position was played between Reichert and Emil Diemer in 1950. How do we deliver mate down the h-file? Well, in this case, it's white to play. White should have taken the rook to avoid rook h8 in the future. White was greedy, took the bishop, and now instead of the bishop, we have a queen on e3 covering mate. So of course, knight g3 check, hg3, and rook h8. And this is the only mate I almost had in a tournament game. Almost, as I said. Okay, let's learn it on Nocti. Let's have a look at Greco's Mate. Okay, learn. One of the earliest known checkmating patterns, named after Gioacchino Greco, a queen or rook delivering checkmate along the edge of the board and supported by the bishop. Good. Complete, preceded by a sacrifice. Okay, so in this case it's going to be rook takes, makes sense, and mate. Okay, white to move and mate in 2. So yeah, this is the almost exact same pattern I had in my own game. Knight check and rook h4. Let's do one more. White to move, of course, queen h7 and rook h3. Let's do one more. White to move and win. Bishop c4, king h8, knight g6, h6, rook h1. Okay, and you can do the rest on your own. Let's continue. Finally, we have the Smothered Mate, and I think this is what every player dreams of, playing in an actual game. I have had it in multiple online games. I've never had it in a tournament game, and I wish I did. The first example we're going to have a look at was from a game played by De La Rochette and Jacques Negro, played in 1983. Now, this is a kind of fancy example to start things off, but the Smothered Mate occurs when the king is stuck in the corner and a knight delivers mate, in this case on c2, but it could be on f7, c7, or f2 or c2. And there is, of course, a piece blocking the king's escape to g1. So if the king is, in this case, on a1, sorry, g1 is here. If the king is on a1, if there is a rook on b1, then knight c2 is mate. And that's the most common way to deliver the smothered checkmate. In this case, of course, pause the video, try to figure it out on your own. Black played queen d3 check. The white king has basically one move. If king c1, then knight e2 is mate immediately, so you cannot go there. If queen c2, then we can just take that. So king a1. And now all we have to do is check on c2. So knight dc2. The king must go to b1 or white must lose the queen. So king b1. Knight a3 check. This is the pattern. A double check, which once again forces the king into the corner. If the king goes to c1, in this case, it's going to be knight a2 checkmate. So mate in 1. So king a1. And now all we have to do is the final blow in the pattern. We need to force a rook to b1 to cut the king off, to completely trap the king on a1. So what do? Queen b1 check. And now the only legal move is rook takes. And now you can choose which knight you want to check with first. It's going to have to be taken. In the game, rook a c2 was played, queen c2, knight c2. This is the smothered mate. And I get why people like this one the most. It just looks brilliant, especially this game where white ended up giving up more than a piece. The second two examples are slightly more straightforward. This is a position from Rodgard Kiryakov 2003, so slightly newer game, and this is a simpler pattern, and this is how it usually occurs in games. The first example was quite fancy. So once again, we have to do this check, so that the rook has to take, and knight f2 mate. So knight f2 check, king g1 only move, knight h3 check. Once again, king h1 only move, because the bishop is covering f1. And now the same pattern, queen g1 check, rook g1 only move, knight f2 checkmate. It's the same pattern, it's just simpler in the second example. And the third example is a bit advanced, and this is what you usually get in normal games. If you have smothered mate or an opportunity for a smothered mate, it's going to look something like this. Now, this was played between Karyakin and Hilar Persson, the guy who named the Tigers Modern, a great player, a grandmaster. And Karyakin in this position played bishop e3, of course threatening queen d5, winning the knight. So black played queen c7. I don't know what else to suggest. If queen d5, in this case, then black can actually play knight e6. So yeah, okay, disregard my last statement. On bishop e3, yeah, I don't think there are many things for black to do. Queen d5 in conjunction with bishop c5 is very important, because if you go queen d5 now, the bishop is looking at b6, so he had to move his queen, although I don't think there was a way out. Either way, Karyakin now wants to play queen b3 check and knight f7. So what does he do? He takes on c5, simply removing the defender of the b3 square and this diagonal. Queen c5, of course, has to be played, and now queen b3. In this position, Hilar Persson resigned. If you don't resign, the only move is king h8, and now knight f7 check. And if the game went on, black would have to take on f7, but if you take on f7, then queen takes f7, and I'm threatening mate on d8, or at least winning a bishop. If the king goes to g8, then we have the same thing. King h8, queen g8, and knight f7. Now this is a smothered mate that didn't happen, but if it had happened, it would have happened this way. Okay, let's have a look at examples on Nocti. Now let's have a look at examples of the smothered mate. Let's learn it. So you can, of course, navigate to each separate chapter, but I'm just going to do the first few. We know what smothered mate is, okay? In its purest form, good. Classic setup, knight f7, knight h6, and queen g8, rook g8, knight f7, we know that. Okay, here, yeah, and knight f7, okay. Now, The Smothered Mate can appear in various forms, sometimes cleverly disguised in a sneaky opening trap. In Steinitz variation of the Caro-Kann. Okay, that's knight d6. Nice! And this is a well-known mistake. I have played in one blitz game against Lovro Čupić in 2016. After that, I learned. Okay, a slight variation of the classic Smothered Mate setup. Let's see that in action. Okay, 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 makes sense. White to move and mate in 3. Seems fairly straightforward. Okay. We know that. Let's do one more. White to move and win. Oh, joke. I'm crazy. Okay. I was looking for the original pattern, but okay, this is why Nocti is good. You can solve many different patterns here. Let's do one more. Okay, this is simple. Good. You can solve the rest on your own. Okay, so once again, you have all of these themes in the description below. Visit Nocti, use the code Hanging Pawns to, get 64% off. And if you don't want to go premium, you have access to the completely free theme with the basics on each checkmate pattern. I will see you in the next one. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.